thank you for giving up time on this beautiful day to come and listen to my presentation. I'm planning to talk for about 20-25 minutes and try and explain some of the work we do and the mechanisms that support our work, and then I'll be very, very happy to take questions from you about that. Okay, so as Adriana said, my name is Emma Kettle. I'm Director of Capability at RedR. I was allowed to choose the title myself, and I decided on a title that was going to be really hard for other people to pin down what I did, because if they don't know what I'm supposed to do, then it's hard for them to hold me accountable. But really, what I do as Director of Capability is I run all of the training and adult education for RedR, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. Just to give you a little bit about my background, as Adriana said, my background is actually teaching and teacher training. In the UK, I was Deputy Head of a secondary school of about 2,000 students before I moved to Australia in 2003, and fully intended to teach, and went to register with the Victorian Institute of Teaching, and they said, oh, you haven't taught in Australia, you probably need to go back in as a junior teacher. And I had one of those moments where I thought, yeah, I don't think I want to do that. And was very lucky, got one of those roles that people trying to get into the development sector now would die for, was as a head of learning and knowledge for Australian Volunteers International, who many of you will have heard of. So the prime volunteer sending program under what was then OCHA. And my job was to design and develop pre-deployment training for volunteers. But I had no previous experience of the development sector. Put together a lovely 3-year plan for AVI, and my then manager looked at it and went, that's really interesting, but I want you to understand the context that we're sending people in. And she sent me to PNG, Timor and Honiara, the Solomons. I came back, tore up the plan, but it started a real love affair for me with the work that I do now, and I can't imagine doing anything else. I've been very lucky since I got to Australia in the roles that I've been able to undertake, because they've taken me to really interesting places and have given me the privilege of working with really, really interesting people, and I'm going to talk about some of those people along the way. But just to give it an introduction and context, I'm going to assume people have little knowledge of disaster and emergency management, but I know that some of you will have, so please bear with me. We think of disaster and emergency management often in terms of a cycle, and traditionally RedR has operated primarily around that disaster event. So over the last 20 odd years, day one of an emergency, day +1, RedR would hit the ground, and they would generally be there for 90, 100, 110 days, and it was called surge capacity. And the principle behind it was that, in all likelihood, following a rapid onset disaster, like an earthquake or a typhoon or a tsunami, the local capacity is likely to be overwhelmed or massively diminished. And the big agencies, the World Visions and the UNs and Oxfams, it takes time for them to be able to deploy. So the whole idea was to provide a surge mechanism that could get people in very quickly, and then by the time either local capacity is coming back or the big agencies can recruit or backfill into that emergency, then our guys can come out. Now surge, the understanding of surge has changed and developed a lot over the last 6 or 7 years that I've been working with RedR. Surge went really from 3 months to 6 months because it was taking longer for agencies to be able to build, to backfill. But also the nature of emergencies we know is getting more and more and more complicated. And then there were complex emergencies like the Syria response, which seems to have been in surge for about 6 years now, where you think you've hit a calm and then it surges again and comes down again and things like that. So RedR was very firmly in that disaster event surge deployment space. And then many of you will have heard of something called the ACC, the Australian Civilian Corps, which was a government operation where they wanted to build their own civilian capability for people who would deploy as Australian government officials, and they could deploy, like us, into predominantly into the UN, but also directly into government. That mechanism was developed and designed, and RedR was one of the training providers for that. But about 2 years ago, DFAT looked at that and said it's ridiculous that we have 2 deployment capabilities, a lot of which was overlapping. A lot of RedRs were also on the ACC as well. And so we've been through quite a long process with DFAT to merge the rosters and bring all of the ACC onto the RedR roster. And we now have a new program called Australia Assists, which is the DFAT mechanism for funding the work that we do. The main advantage, or the main thing that will take RedR into new space is the fact that we'll now be able to deploy across the whole of the cycle. So not just disaster response and surge deployments, but through stabilisation recovery and right around the whole resilience building, disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management. And they're there in stages, but everybody knows that really it's like a kaleidoscope. If you turn the kaleidoscope, everything moves. It's like that. But that's the easiest way to explain it to people who may not really know about how it's divided. And also historically, funding was divided, and this was a big inhibitor to a coherent way of managing responses. That if you worked in this, you weren't allowed to use that money for this bit. And the thinking has changed a lot with donors, and so there's a lot more flexibility about using money across programs. And understanding that part of effective disaster response is having effective disaster preparedness before it. It seems so obvious to us now, but really even 3 or 4 years ago that funding was totally compartmentalised for organisations like us, and it was very difficult to move outside of that. So the surge capacity is quite a formal one, but just to give you Australia's part in it. So RedR Australia has its own mission, which is to save lives and alleviate suffering by building resilience and responding to disasters and conflict. So the resilience building is a really important part of what we do, especially from the training perspective. About 50% of the training we provide is to local responders, so people who are likely to be living within the disaster-affected community when disaster strikes, and the other half would be for offshore people going in as part of an international response. The photograph at the bottom right is after TC Pam in Vanuatu, tropical cyclone Pam. That's one of the UNICEF school in a box. So I don't know if you've heard of school in a box. It's literally a school in a box. 2 coffin-like boxes, about 2.5 metres long by half a metre deep, half a metre wide, and you unpack them. 3 hours later, in theory, if the instructions are not missing, you have a school for students. So temporary shelter, a safe place for students post-emergency. If you go to Vanuatu now, you'll still see a lot of the school, and the boxes are still there on school premises because it allows them, they're pretty sturdy. But tricky to put up without the instructions. I have experience of that. So RedR achieves that by maintaining our humanitarian roster. Our roster is about 700 people now. Now obviously that's not 700 people sitting at home waiting for the phone to ring. That is a mixture of people who do this as a full-time occupation. They'll go to an emergency maybe for 6 months, come home for a month, say hello to the family, do their washing, eat properly, and then go off again. Other people will do 1 a year. Others will do them less frequently than that, depending on when they can get leave of absence from work and things like that. Obviously, during big emergencies, then when the demand is great, we get a lot of support from Australian employers who will let their staff just go. It's easier for people who are not full-time responders to obviously do short-term deployments. It's easier to get 4 weeks off work than 4 months. It kind of makes sense. So we have the short-term deployments for emergency relief work, and now hopefully the longer term. We provide preparedness training for humanitarian workers, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and we work to build resilience in disaster-affected communities around the world. A key principle of what we do is to move away from the very hierarchical top-down, we go in and tell people how they should rebuild their countries, into really working in partnership with local organisations, local institutions and local governments, bearing in mind that some governments may not have full capacity, to build a better understanding of what the needs of the community are and to be able to service those needs. 2 very different attitudes in terms of development and emergency response, which Serge needs to understand. In the development context, because people are there for very long periods of time, very often the invitation comes with a mandate to bring about change. So you're working in you're in Timor for 2 years and you're working in WASH programming, water and sanitary hygiene. There may be an expectation around that program that you will bring about change, that has improvements to conditions. Very often as a surge responder, when you're working with a community, they want things back the way they were. So one of the challenges for us is to ensure that our response meets the do no harm principles, of course, but also is cognizant of some things which may not already be culturally embedded in a country before a disaster, which may be around women's rights, it could be around sexual and reproductive rights. We have to be able to balance all of those factors as well as serving the immediate need, putting up shelters, providing food, and things like that. So, as I said, ahead of crises, we train people. All of our trainers are field personnel as well. So all of us have deployed, worked in developing countries, worked in big emergencies. We think that's really important. The younger the people we train, in many respects, the more they value that experience. When we're training teaching into universities, people want to understand what the reality of the field is like. But obviously we do training with very experienced people as well. And then, as I've said, we're on permanent standby. The average time it takes us to get somebody out of the door is about 72 hours, which is pretty good. The thing that holds us up is visas. So visas are a nightmare at the moment with Bangladesh, because they've tightened up on the number of foreign international responders coming in, and quite rightly so, because they've been inundated. But now there are issues about getting people visas fast enough, because there's a big demand. But often during a big emergency, something that's classed as a level 3, and a level 3 is an emergency where there's an acknowledgement that the capacity of the affected country has been overwhelmed, and international responders will come in at the invitation of the government. Very often things like visas will be waived. So after Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, within about 48 hours, the government had said as long as these people have this letter, they don't need a visa, and eventually could get people in really, really quickly. So doesn't work if it takes somebody 3 months to get them there.
Yeah.
So the standby partnership mechanism is a mechanism of cooperating agencies made up of UN partners, and these are the UN standby partners that RedR works with, and organisations like RedR who will work in collaboration to identify technical needs across all of the big emergencies globally, and then to provide and feed into those. So I'm sure you'll have heard of most of those: the World Food Programme, UNICEF, the Children's Fund, World Health Organization. There may be a few that are less well known, like UNFPA, the Population Fund, UNDP, the Development Programme. But each of these, during an emergency, I'll give you an example, we will get an email through, and it might be from FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, saying because of the earthquake in PNG recently, there are now food security issues. We need a nutrition and food security specialist to come in, work in PNG. We need them probably for 4 months. We need them tomorrow. We send that invitation out to our roster. They have overnight to reply. We choose the most appropriate ones, usually 2 or 3, send them to FAO. FAO says, okay, we'll have him, and then we put you on a plane. Because you've been pre-trained, pre-vetted, you've been pre-medicalized, you've had all of those testing and training done, it means that we can get people out quickly. It also means that we can provide a guarantee to the UN agency of the quality of that person, because they've been through competency training, and of course they've been through all of the rigors that you would expect, like police checks and child protection checks and things like that. So that's quite a wide range. We're not the only UN standby partner. We're the only non-government UN standby partner. So other partners are like the Danish Refugee Council, Norwegian Refugee Council, Canada, which is the Canadian agency, the German agency, but they're all arms of government. But they do the same thing that we do. So effectively we're in competition with them because we all want to get our people out into the field. But as we're the only one in this region and in the Southern Hemisphere altogether, we have a massive advantage in terms of servicing certainly the Indo-Pacific region. But we send people everywhere. So last year, just to give you an example of the sort of numbers we're talking about, this is from our annual report. We went to 39 countries. In terms of technical profiles, large numbers of wash engineering, and that will range from literally guys, the sort of guy who goes around taking photos of hydrants, you know, the sort of person I mean, the people who really love anything that's to do with digging in pipes, photos are being taken. So very obvious infrastructure work to sanitation, health education, water supplies, waste disposal and all of those kinds of things. Supply chain logistics, You can imagine in the big responses, obviously there's the need for vast numbers of supply. During the medical emergencies, the very specialist areas around cold chain supplies, there was a massive demand for cold chain supply people during the Ebola response because of the distances they were having to travel with medications. Information management. Information management has been one of the fastest growing areas of demand in the sector globally. During Typhoon Haiyan, they declared a global shortage of IMOs, International Information Management Officers. There literally weren't enough of them to service the emergency. 20 years ago, information managers would tell you the problem was gathering data, gathering sufficient data. Now, because of drones and distribution of mobile phones and mobile phone surveys in the big refugee camps, they're now overwhelmed with data, and it's the analysis and synthesization of that data that's the challenge. Emergency preparedness and emergency response, which you would expect. Humanitarian affairs, they tend to be working through OCHA in coordination roles. Emergency education, which is my area. So again, seen as a primary response to get children back into school as quickly as possible. The benefits of doing that are massive in emergencies. Not only does it normalise things for children very quickly, it gives parents respite. And we look at emergencies like, say, the Syria response and the amount of time Syrians have been in the main 5 countries that took refugees, that the loss of education over that period has a massive effect on the ability of a community to recover. If you lose 5 years education, that's virtually a whole generation have lost the opportunity to go to vet, to go to uni, to get their school certificates and things like that. So education in emergencies is considered life-saving. General protection. So protection covers all of the roles that are addressing the portion of a community who are likely to be the most vulnerable. So in any emergency, the existing most vulnerable people will be disproportionately affected by a disaster. So that if a typhoon hits Darwin in the next couple of weeks, the homeless, the disabled, the people with disabilities, people in aged care, children unaccompanied minors, all of those people are likely to be disproportionately affected by a disaster. The other big factor in terms of emergency is moving populations. Whenever you have a population on the move, people are much more vulnerable than when they're safe and secure, even if it's in a refugee centre or an IDP centre. So there are some very specialised areas around protection. So protection includes things like registering people when they come in to camps so that they can't be trafficked out. Unaccompanied minors, so that people up to the age, in theory of 18, but a lot of the focus is up to 16-year-olds. When you've got 10 to 16-year-olds who are heads of household because all of the adults have been separated or lost. So those protection areas are particularly important, and there's a very high demand for all of those across all emergencies. Cash and voucher is a fairly new, relatively new in terms of the sector. If you think 40 to 50 years ago, World Food Programme's main focus, if you looked at their brochures, it was food distribution. It was giving out bread, giving out rice, at nutritional centres in camps and things like that. That still happens, but there's been a massive shift towards being able to give people cash or vouchers, which means virtual vouchers as well, in order that an economy can run, in order that people can make choices. When people have lost everything, I mean literally everything but what they're standing in, even being able to make small choices about what they feed their children is a humanising thing, and it's a really important part of the response. So that's been a massive growth area. Initially, they started to introduce the beep, you know, like in the supermarket where you beep things through and then it tells you it can't read, you know, an unrecognised thing. When it started in the sector, there was a real shortage because all of the expertise was in the retail area. You know, Coles Myer and Woolworths had all of the expertise around beeping. And so part of our job at RedR is to try and anticipate trends and understand where the technical gaps are going to be, which is why partnerships with universities is really important as well, because we can then feed that back with universities and talk about innovations in the field and things like that, so that we can anticipate the professional needs for 3 or 4 years' time. I mentioned child protection, sexual and gender-based violence. We know that rape is a weapon of war now in many situations, and we also know that in even natural disasters, domestic and sexual violence tends to rise. because people are under stress and all kinds of other factors going on. So there are people whose role in emergencies is to focus on that for men and women and girls and boys. So it's not just about women and girls, this is about everybody being more vulnerable for things. So like during Ebola, a big factor was that young men and women were undertaking transactional sex for food and for shelter. So these people are looking after these kind of things as well. By agency, we deploy across agencies, and then by region you can see, obviously our key donor is DFAT currently, although we get funding from DFAT, which is the UK aid agency, and a very small amount from private donors. So there's a strong emphasis on the Pacific, but RedR has always said it will go where the need is greatest. If we get demands for help in Haiti or the Caribbean, then we will send people there. To give you some examples of some of the big emergencies that we've worked. The Philippines, Typhoon Haiyan, I'm sure many people will remember that. We deployed 28 people, mainly into Cebu. Some people were in Manila working in coordination. A lot of work around waste management and contaminated waste, shelter, nutrition and protection. The Syrian response has been a really interesting response. I mentioned 5 countries that the bulk of the Syrian refugees have gone to. So Lebanon, Egypt, Turkey, Jordan, and Iraq. There's always, I always forget one. And this is a photograph from Zartri camp in Jordan, which at one point was taking 4,000 people a day during its peak. And they couldn't build the camp fast enough to accommodate the number of people coming over the border. If you look at aerial maps of it, you can see that it started off very planned, and then literally they were just putting tents up, trying to keep up with the number of people that were attending. As the camp evolved, people started to move. So people wanted to be in family groups, which I think we can all understand as well. So here you've got a really good example of things being moved. So you set that satellite there. Because once people realise they're not going home, they want to make life as livable and as normal as possible. And satellite TV is part of that, I guess. We deployed 67 people over the last 3 to 4 years there, including camp designers. One of our guys, Richard Simpson, was in charge of all of the electrical supply for the camp. And that included managing people who were connecting to the mains and all of that kind of thing, so making sure the camp didn't burn down because people were literally just getting bulldog clips and clipping onto the mains so that they could put heaters and things like that. So a complicated emergency which persists now. A lot of people from Zartri camp have now moved into Azraq camp, which that's just another view of Zartri with the water tower. But very inhospitable land. It's all sharp shale. It's not sand underfoot, so you can't walk in bare feet. It's not very comfortable and very hot, as you would imagine, in summer and freezing in the winter. So that's Azraq camp, 15 square kilometres, totally designed though. So UNHCR felt that they'd been caught out during the Zartri emergency, and so Zartri was over capacity, so they started to design and build Azraq camp. They wanted it to be weatherproof, so that's why there are the huts rather than tents. But it does look like a prison camp. It's really anonymous and not very, it just doesn't feel very homely, sounds bizarre. But it runs like a proper town, so there are supermarkets there. So again, as I said, people can go and buy their own things. They were the first camp to introduce the retinal scanning for when people arrive in the camps, and that retinal scanning is linked to the supermarkets, so that when you go shopping with the family, you can make sure, because they used to give them credit on phones, but then the phones were stolen or people were coerced to give up the phones, so then they did cash transfers on vouchers, but they were stolen. The retinal scanning, nobody can take, no, there can be none of that. The other big advantage of the retinal scanning is the trafficking, that it's harder for somebody to say, oh, this is my daughter, I'm just taking her out for the day, because people can come and go from the camps, because now they can scan, and it's massively reduced the trafficking into other countries, which obviously is a massive benefit. So Azraq camp, they made this not to electrify it when they built it. And I think I've probably regretted that because, again, people are now incorporating and adapting and doing their own thing. But yeah, originally people had anticipated that people would be going home. So the first time I went to Zartri, the schools were empty. There were some really nice schools on the camp built by UNICEF, Save the Children, all of those organisations. And when you talked to the refugees, they were saying, no, we're going home soon. So it's pointless putting the kids in school to learn the Jordanian curriculum. We want them to learn the Syrian curriculum because otherwise what use is it for them to have? And then I was back about a year and a half later and the schools were packed because it had sunk into people that this wasn't going to be over soon and they needed to get the kids back into school. And there are schools and hospitals on those sites, as you would imagine, as well. Under the terms of the agreement with the Jordanian government, they're not allowed any permanent infrastructure. So there's no sewerage or anything, everything, or water in, waste out. So it's about 4,000 trucks a week, I think. So we had one of our washies, Catherine, we had two, there's tall cat and little cat, and all little cat's job was to make sure that waste going out didn't become a health hazard. So it wasn't really what we would call a glamour gig, that particular one for her. That's the sort of logistics challenge that you're looking at for, this is from Iraq. One of our logisticians was there. It's one of the bigger distribution points outside of Erbil, which was one of the key refugee areas. And things were moving very quickly in Iraq about 2.5, 3 years ago. And one of the concerns for RedR, obviously, is keeping our people safe and well. If we can't guarantee as much as possible their safety, then they can't do their job. So, interestingly enough, though, he said that wasn't the biggest challenge for him. That's his shadow, actually, taking a photograph there. That's the daily convoy going out. He said the hardest decision for him every day was signing off on that convoy, because there would be roadside bombings and all kinds of things going on. So taking responsibility to sign and say that it was safe caused an inordinate amount of stress. He said that was much harder than working out square tonnage of food and things like that. So for RedR, we're looking for people not just with technical capacity, but people with judgment, people who have resilience, because the context that they're going into can be very trying, tiring. Ultimately, we hope rewarding, but not for the faint-hearted, perhaps. The Sudan and South Sudan response, classed as a complex emergency because you have contributing factors. It's not just like a rapid onset typhoon, say. Pre-existing conflict, pre-existing drought, shortages of food, a civil war, cross-border problems. A lot of different factors have contributed to the problems that the Sudanese people and the South Sudanese people are suffering. So we're sending people in there, a lot of food security people, a lot of protection, a lot of education people as well. That's a photograph from the Ebola. So RedR was one of the first civilian organisations to allow to deploy into Ebola. The challenge was getting people out, not getting people in. So the Australian government was not prepared to sign off on anybody deploying into the 3 affected countries in West Africa until we knew how we'd get people out if somebody was infected. So do you remember there was the American nurse? It's scared, it's just massively disproportionate panic attack that went around the whole world, that all of a sudden everybody was going to die of Ebola. But the challenge for Australia was you can't fly somebody from West Africa to Australia without a stopover somewhere. And the Australians couldn't find a country that would agree to the stopover, like Singapore, Thailand. Because as soon as the plane landed, you had all issues around decontamination and things like that. It wasn't until we signed an agreement with the British hospital ships, which were offshore, to say that if any of the Australians got sick, they would go there, and then obviously they'd be able to access London and the School of Tropical Medicine and things like that. So there was this big Western media like hysteria thing, and then everybody kind of calmed down and realised that very few medical staff, if they were properly trained, were becoming infected, and with the right PPE, the personal protective equipment, and the right preparation, it could be effectively managed. So WHO had a challenge, and their target was to train 100,000 epidemiologists and supporting health workers within 4 months. So I deployed into WHO to manage that project. I nearly died when they told me that number. I was saying, how many? They said 100,000 in 3 months. That's in 90 days. We're going to have to get 100,000 people through. And there was no course. So we had to design a course, pilot it, deliver it. So we set up this structure, which happened to be all female, and we thought about that before. So that's in Ghana. So people were using Ghana as a safe country and deploying in and out of Ghana, because as soon as you went into the affected countries, at that time, I then wouldn't have been able to come back to Australia for 21 days, so there was all of that. And they were each a manager for each of the countries. So we decided the only way we were going to be able to get these 100,000 people trained was I trained these 3 people, they went and trained 20 people, who then trained 20 people, and we had to do it that way. That was the only way. The advantage of that was that we were building local capacity very, very quickly. Interesting, the woman on the left here was actually a refugee from Sierra Leone when she was a young woman. So we couldn't send her back to Sierra Leone. She went into Guinea as the lead trainer for that. But she said it was her experience as a refugee as a child, and the fact that Australia had taken her in that meant that she wanted to come back and do something for other people. So Ebola was very complex. This is a photograph from one of our deployees, Darren. He was with UNICEF, funded by DFAT, and his job was to go with UNICEF monitoring teams and make sure that food distribution was happening as it should. You can imagine in any big distribution context, the potential for theft of goods, a black market, or things going to the wrong people can be quite extensive, especially over 3 countries, with very little infrastructure in some cases. And he was in a community on the day that somebody in the community had been tested positive. Therefore, the whole of the village had to be quarantined for the 21 days. And he said that was just all of the kids just hanging around, because now none of them could go to school, none of the parents could go to work. And so, again, as implementing needed restrictions to manage a disease, but our role is to understand what will be the human needs as a result of what we've implemented. So food distribution, education, child-friendly spaces and things like that. And there was a big problem with people trying to leave quarantine and things like that. That's a food distribution point. You can see people carrying water. Hygiene kits were one of the big distribution areas, and the idea was that everybody would get their first kit free, and it was pretty much soap in a bucket, because the Ebola virus actually, with a good enough soap, is quite easy to kill. So the idea was that if we can teach basic hand washing, the hours I spent doing hand washing songs with kids you just wouldn't believe. But the reality is that the hand washing kits ran out, and the Red Cross kits cost about $1 a day. But in Sierra Leone at the time, the average income, I think, was $1 a month. So if it's a choice of feeding your family or buying the soap and water, you're going to feed your family. So ongoing issues about how to do that. And all of those hand washing education programs, again, fine in a country like ours, where we have access to clean, potable water, but in a country where less than 20% of the population have access to anything like a designated toilet, let alone something that flushes with water and things like that. Things like personal hygiene become massively challenging. And it was really hot. They reckoned that a day in the PPE gear was the fastest, they said, better than Jenny Craig. The kilos would fall. The joke was that at the end of the day they'd get out their wellies and empty their wellies because it was so hot. And so part of the thing was looking after the workers as well, and making sure people didn't have heat stroke and fatigue and things like that. And managing the psychological impact of all of that. The Nepal earthquakes, there were 2 earthquakes in Nepal, which killed over 8,000 people and left 8.1 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. So we deployed 9 specialists into the region very early on. You can imagine a lot of them were around reconstruction, but also civil military. So people don't often appreciate, unless they're from defence, that defence are very often, and military are very often first responders in the big humanitarian emergencies now. Massive capacity in terms of logistics and engineering and other areas as well, but there are tensions there. Notoriously, the humanitarian sector and the military sector don't always play nice together. Very different cultures, very different expectations, and so there are actually roles within the humanitarian sector called CivMil or SimCord. And the job of the civil military person is to do that, is to be able to talk to military and understand what the military are doing, what their objectives are, how they're going to work, talk to the humanitarian side, and then ensure that they're working effectively together. We deployed a civil expert into Nepal, but another one into Vanuatu at TC PAM, and I spoke to Shadrach, who was the NDMO of Vanuatu afterwards, and sort of said to him, how did Dale do on his deployment? He said he was great, I didn't have to speak to anybody in Khaki at all. And he wasn't being disparaging, he just meant it meant I can focus, and Dale was bringing me a single message about what the military were doing, and I could talk to him about our needs. It just helped manage all of that. That's one of our deployees helping unload stuff. Because obviously a lot of the response in Nepal, the issue was about access. That only donkeys and helicopters could make it. And donkeys were very slow, and helicopters are very expensive and very dangerous because of wind pocketing. I don't really know what that is, but I imagine it's to do with turbulence in mountainous areas. That's one of our CivMil guys who's now actually our regional manager in Jordan, Mel Schmidt. Mel is CivMil, ex-military himself. And I show this photograph when, especially when I'm talking at universities with young students who say, how can we do your job? Because they have this vision of what it is. And I say to them, this is Mel's campsite. He lived like this for 3 months. The tent, first on his left, that's his little rubbish bag hanging. That's his shower, and the other one is his toilet. He's decanting his daily water supply before he leaves the base, because one of the big issues in Nepal was tons and tons and tons of plastic bottles of water coming in, and no means of disposing of the plastic, so creating massive waste issues, waste disposal issues as well, because they were burning it at one point, which of course was causing secondary issues. So that's my, I just love the resigned look on his face. It's just like, yeah, this is me. And as I say, he was like that for some time, because obviously there was no accommodation available for people to stay in. Not all of the deployments are quite that nerve-tingling, if I can put it that way. This is a deployment, he's kind of blended in there. This guy, Regan Patangaroa, he's a professor of architecture, a massively experienced shelter expert. He's currently in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, helping do work on bamboo constructions. He's there on deployment. This particular area in Iran was being washed out by flooding every year. So the floods would come, the little town was washed out, they would rebuild it, the next year it would be washed out, because it was traditional land and they didn't really have very many options about where else to go without loss of rights. So this is another factor for, again, any moving population about what happens with land rights. And you can imagine how complicated that would be. So he was there to negotiate and find out what was going to be an acceptable solution to the community leaders. One of his colleagues was with the women elsewhere, just in case you're wondering, because obviously it's really important to understand all of the community needs, not just one perspective. And the result eventually was that they would build up, that there was a way they could effectively raise the buildings a bit, and you would see that kind of building in floodplains all over the world. It's just that wasn't a traditional approach, so it needed some change management and consultation around that. So he said that deployment was a lot of sitting and listening, which can be challenging for doers, for people who want to get things fixed, just spending the time to listen so that when you do work on a solution with a community, they're ready to listen to you as well, because they feel they've been listened to as well. Now this is some footage from a drone from Cox's Bazar. So I got back from Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, which is the primary recipient in Bangladesh for Rohingya, moving across from the Myanmar border. And there are a series of camps now in Bangladesh, not far from Cox's Bazar. And the largest one is Kutupalang camp, which has now been classified as a mega camp, and it's been divided into what they're calling suburbs. Each suburb has, I think, about 100,000 people in it. This is drone footage from September, since which time the camp has doubled in density. So I just thought it might be useful for you to see. It's only a couple of minutes. It's a nice example to begin with of how drone The use of drones is massively changing the ability of responders to very quickly assess. It's just vast. It goes on and on and on. You can see some of the older areas where people have been for a number of years, and then the newer areas here. Prone to flooding, which is going to be an issue because the wet season is about to come up in about the next 10 weeks, and they know that big sections of the camp are likely to flood with flash floods. So you can see that's fairly new. There's distribution point there and UNHCR tents. But all of these areas there, that's flowing water in September. So that's during the dry season. Deforestation is a massive problem for the Bangladeshi. Now, when we were there, UNDP said we've got about another 6 to 8 months, that if they continue the deforestation at the same rate as they have been, we're going to get past the point of no return, where we're not going to be able to replant and rebuild. And the deforestation is causing its own issues because of landslides. It's disturbing the infrastructure of the ground and things. And for any of you who've done shelter training before, you know that ideally you're building shelters on a very slight gradient so that there's water runoff. The majority of the shelters in Cox's Bazar, in the camps in Cox's, are on really, really steep gradients, which is causing massive issues. These walkways were made of mud, so one of our engineers has been in, and his job has been to make water-resistant walkways, and they've been testing them with concrete and various other materials to try and make them weatherproof. It zooms in a little bit here. Yeah, so here you can start to see the detail. Steps carved out of hillsides, one good rainstorm and that's all going to wash away. So a lot of what they're doing now is trying to backfill and reconstruct. They're moving people out of flood zones to try and move them already into higher land because there have already been landslides and people have been killed. It's one of those emergencies. We were talking in training the other day, and I said if we put all of the factors into a training exercise, people wouldn't believe all of these things could be happening. So WFP have come up with a really smart idea about escape routes, so that should there be flash flooding, they've looked at the whole of the camp and have identified high land that people can be told to go to so that they can get out. But 3 of the escape routes go across the natural migration paths of the elephants that are protected in Bangladesh, and there have already been deaths with elephants coming into the camps. It's the sort of thing, if you threw it into a training scenario, people would say, that's just silly, that could never happen. So the factors are so complex. You can see people just... So all of this is now built up. There's none of these gaps here anymore. No electrification, very small amount of solar. So once curfew is at about 6:30, so all of our staff will leave the camp at 6:30 for curfew, and then go back into, they actually stay in Coxtown mostly. It's just pitch black, absolutely pitch black. So again, you can imagine living there. It's not just about the inhibition of your life to begin with, but once it's dark, you can't do anything. You can't play with the kids, you can't read, you can't do anything, because it literally is pitch black. The shelters you'll see are tarps and bamboo, so the distribution really is people being given those kinds of resources. There is some infrastructure in terms of toilets and water points, but because of the lack of ability to really make permanent structures, because of, again, they're not allowed to do anything permanent because it's a temporary solution, means that they're less than perfect. So these are, this is a team that one of our guys is supervising. So when people turn up and they're given their kit, you can see the tarps there and strapping, which they make out of leaves, and they build a frame, and then they read the frame, and then they line it with the big tarpaulin. The construction crews are there to help. So their job is to go with the people who've been given stuff, help them if they don't have able-bodied people in their family to do that kind of thing. So there's been a phenomenal response on behalf of the Bangladeshi government. About 80% of the people working in the response are Bangladeshi nationals who've been hired either by the agencies or were already existing employees. The Bangladeshis have enormous capacity in terms of domestic response. They know how to manage their own typhoons and things like that, but the whole mechanism of an international emergency is new to them. So the training RedR has been doing is working with people like these teams and giving them the basics of this is who the UN are. This is what do no harm principle means. This is what protection is. So when people are talking to you about that. So doing some real basic fundamentals training. There are also cash for work programs. So the Rohingya are allowed to be employed. There are a lot of restrictions, but for example, World Food Programme has cash for work programs which allow people to be employed on helping with things like this. And then that means there is some income going to people who otherwise would be getting nothing. It gives them a little bit of independence. But they're very highly regulated because you can imagine the tensions that that might cause if locals think that the Rohingya are getting our jobs and all of that kind of thing can be tricky. But it's being managed very well by the agencies who are used to doing this kind of negotiation. So this is known as Tristan's Bridge. Tristan is one of our deployees who's in Bangladesh, and that's the design that they have now come up with, which has been tested already. And I think they were saying it's about 60,000 people cross that every day. So if the bridge wasn't there, and it's roadworthy now, our little van came across that. Those are guys from construction teams with bamboos. But you can see the nature of the accommodation, containers, and this is really rank. It's not very hygienic or clean. And again, the big worry about the rains and the storms coming is that that will be contamination and sickness. Mainsoon on the left, he's at a food distribution point. So they had to make a decision, obviously as they register people, they have very, very organised food distribution because not everybody can access work or access food otherwise. And they made the decision to make the women head of household. So you have to nominate a head of household who will be responsible for food for that family. And they did it, A, because they tend to get more accurate numbers when they use women, because the women know about all of the extra kids that are around. And B, it's a protection issue as well, that in a community that may want to hide women, it's a validation of the women coming out so that they can have access to health, to support and counselling and things like that as well. So that's with two of the local UNHCR and World Food Programme. He's working with World Food Programme, and they've set up this, it's a 4-staged postal distribution. So you have the actual food distribution, you're going to be next, you're queuing at this, so it has to be very, very well managed, because when people are tired and hot and hungry, that's when you can have to deal with quite tense issues and situations. So he's basically getting to the camp at about 6, 7 in the morning, and he leaves at curfew at about 6, 7 at night. Because I saw him about 2 months ago in Melbourne. I said, oh my God, you've grown a beard. He said, yeah, I haven't got time to shave. It's wasted time in the day. So he'll be there for 3 months, and yeah, he'll be tired when he finishes. Training, we try to prepare people for the reality and for them to understand, you try and put a tarp up and some poles, you're going to have a very different attitude to other people trying to do that when you're in the field. So our training is very simulation based. That's from our logistics training before they get in the plane. Safety and security training is a big part of what we do. That's from our first aid and safety security training. So it's a simulated road traffic accident with security implications. Kidnapping training. It's much more fun to be a trainer than to be one of the recipients of that, trust me. A certain training that happened here in Darwin last year, so we train into the undergrad course here as well. Happy looking participants. So what RedR is looking for, and the reason we spend time working with universities is about, as I said, anticipating and managing change, the ability to solve real problems that real people are facing, to be able to share skills and expertise across institutions, and then to collaborate to form global hookups. What we can offer, we believe, with Charles Darwin Uni is our internship program, which gives people the opportunity to work with us. Volunteering, we use, because our training is simulation training, once people have done our courses we invite them back to be volunteers, which is when they get payback for having been a participant the last time, and obviously opportunities for research. So I'll finish with 2 photos, and to me these photos sum up what it is to be a RedR deployee and why I am kind of proud of what we do. So that photograph is Daryl, who's a King logistician. He has done more deployments than any other person on the RedR roster over the years. He's just about to deploy, I can't remember where, but he's just about to go out again. And that was the day he arrived at Sartri camp, and that was the state of one of his warehouses. And when I went and visited him a few months later, that was his warehouse. Now, apart from the fact that one's a mess and one is tidy, can you spot a difference between the mattresses in this photo and the mattresses in that one? They're coloured. So Darryl found out that the coloured mattresses cost the same amount as the black ones, and the kids loved the coloured ones, and they could choose their mattress when they turned up. And he said for him, that was the difference, that we're trying to remember that if we get lost in the numbers of 3 million mattresses and forget that we're dealing with kids who've lost everything, with families who've lost everything, then we're not doing all of our job. So to me, this typifies what we want from RedR and the expectations we have with people who work for RedR. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emma. That was really insightful and very interesting. And I'm sure some people in the room might have some questions. Please feel free to ask questions directly to Emma.
Well, a question specific to your mission statement. And you speak about building resilience.
Yeah.
So how do you do that? How do you train for that? How do you manage that expectation?
That's really interesting because there are lots of discussions about what resilience building is.
Yeah.
And depending on the body of thought, it'll be from about empowerment, that you can't build resilience without empowering, right, not down to, but across to the pure providing skills and increased capacity with any group or community. So when we talk about building resilience, it's about the ability for a community to be better prepared for disasters, which hopefully will mitigate the impact of those disasters, not just through training, but through shared experiences. There's also an area of training around resilience, which is about personal safety and security, that you can train people to be more resilient in terms of mental health and mental resilience as well. So I guess my answer is that it's something of all of those things. It's a tricky thing to pin down. How do you measure that a community is more resilient than it was, which is an ongoing challenge for a lot of the work that we do. But I would say that our key area of influence in terms of resilience is respect for the knowledge and existing experience of you want to call it host community or the affected community, and to use that as your starting point. Because if you're undermining that, you're effectively going to be undermining resilience as well.
Thanks very much for an interesting presentation. It's a side that we from don't get to see a whole lot, so it certainly opened my eyes. My question relates to your disaster management and response circle that had the initial incident and the steps building up to another incident. You touched on risk management and risk reduction. Do you guys do any consultation for that? And if so, do you do that at the request of the local population, or how does that request get funneled to you?
Yeah, so that we do it on request, and those conversations start with the relationship. So we have a regional manager in Suva who will be on good terms with the national disaster management officers across the Pacific, will understand what their capacities and weaknesses are, what areas they want support in, and that's how those conversations start. The best conversations, I think, happen over time, which is why we have regional managers. And in terms of the resilience, so if we look at a country like Vanuatu, for example, having a real understanding, the better we can understand what the existing capacities and ability to withstand emergencies or withstand like one-off events, then the better we are equipped to be able to anticipate and meet their needs. But yeah, it absolutely has to be at the invitation of the government. That doesn't mean that we can't add advice and perspective that they may not have, but it's very important that we have that local knowledge. Otherwise, we end up with the sort of responses which the aid sector is littered with plug-in responses that come in over the top and don't work, or aren't technically resilient, or are gone within a year because there wasn't the proper meshing with the local needs and capacities and things underneath.
Yeah. Right, thank you.
Yeah. Sorry?
In view of the nature of the areas you operate in and your acknowledgement that the military partners have got the logistics and the size and the organizational capabilities, I was wondering what percentage of your volunteers, your staff, actually ex-military
Oh, that's
personnel?
interesting. In the logistics area, lots of them will be ex-military. Same with safety and security experts, people who are used to doing safety and security assessments. Some of the engineers, but I think that they would be the big areas. Logisticians, lots of them are ex-military. And as well, what you were just saying before, we need to better understand the military as well. So RedR now works with the Australian Civil Military Centre in Canberra. 2 of my staff were just at the peacekeeping seminar in Canberra last week, where they were the only NGOs there. And part of their job was to make the military understand our perspective, but also for us to learn more about their operational imperatives and what their understanding of emergency and disaster responses as well. So you had your hand up?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to word it, but what I'm interested in is what mechanisms you might have in place for the systematic and ongoing gathering information and then putting that into perhaps something like a manual or and then that manual gets updated a lot. Do you have those processes in place, and then how do I get access to those manuals?
Okay. So in terms of technical areas, so there are things like the Sphere project. So the Sphere project was an attempt to put minimum standards across lots of different contexts. So for example, if we're going to build a camp and we're having to provide water, we should aim at 15 litres of water per person per day.
That kind of information.
And
exactly.
we should have this this yardage per person, and there should be 10 metres gap every 100 tents to make sure that we have fire breaks. That nobody should have to walk more than 200 metres to get water. So if you're giving somebody 15 litres of water per person per day, and you have a family of 5, and the 14-year-old son is gathering the water, and the water's 2 kilometres away, you've got a massive issue on your hand. So things like the Sphere project, which is available online, but they do hard copies as well. If you come and do our course, you get a free copy. That's not the only one. WFP have their own, WHO have their own, so there's specialised books that are basically saying they're aspirational, no, not mandatory. So when I was in Cox's Bazar, I said, are we meeting Sphere for shelter? He said, not even close. Some people are too, the accommodations are too close, the accommodations aren't big enough, there's not sufficient ventilation in them, things like that. So they're aspirational because you have to work within your means.
Following on from that, is there also information being gathered that can be used in more long-term building resilience, even in developed countries? So you take knowledge about how the disasters occur, and you want to be able to prevent further disasters from happening. And so, is the knowledge being gathered? You know, what kind of towns get washed away? Obviously, on floodplains.
Yeah, absolutely.
More than that, learning from our experience, learning from each disaster, and accumulating that knowledge, so that we can, when building or planning a new permanent town, permanent structures, we can build them more resilient. That kind of knowledge,
there's
more the long term.
So much. So there are a lot. There are probably about 200 studies that were just done about Haiti, about the reconstruction of Haiti and things like that. Lots of academic journals, lots of academic.
Academic journals are not very useful in disaster.
Well, it's about how they synthesize
manuals.
back into, yes, and lots of work around manuals. It's very hard across contexts, I would say, but things like the Sphere project and others, and the core humanitarian standards, serve as a useful benchmark for people so that they know where they're pitching at. In terms of the resilience is an interesting part of that, because that's not in those manuals. That's the overlay that we need to provide, I think, rather than just the numbers. But those numbers are a really good start. They're a really good negotiation point if you're negotiating for land with a government and say, well, look, if we've got 100,000 people, the little plot of land you've given us is just not going to meet international expectations, and it will not reflect well on you if you're not meeting those international expectations. So they can be useful in that way, but they can also be useful for you to look at what the gradient is, the S-bio gradient, for you to be building shelter and things like that. So Sphere's the one I would recommend people to start with. And if you just go into sphereproject.org, yes, just .org, you can get it online and things, and they'll send you copies for free. So. Yes.
Thanks for the presentation, and it was really helpful to hear the examples and the stories, just to bring to life the work that the team are doing. I was curious to find out a bit more about, you talked about the resilience and the difficult situations that the staff are working on. So when people are deployed, what and how are you providing support for
Yeah.
your staff and their
Sure.
mental health
Yeah.
and access?
So there are two primary support mechanisms for our staff. Before somebody deploys, they're given a deployment advisor. So that is your person to go to, and they look after your travel, your medical, I don't know, your accommodation floods. This is the person you can ring. Your pay gets held up, or you've got a problem at home that you need sorting out. So they have that first primary person who filters a lot and is there to support them through their job. If they've got a problem with their supervisor, all of that very practical stuff. We also use psychosocial support because we realise that, and we do some training with people before they deploy. So we do work on cumulative stress, just that, like Minson, that daily grind of 6 to 6 at least, working without a break, working weekends, just becoming run down and tired, and how to recognise that in yourself and in other people. But then we also do some training on on rapid onset or traumatic, I forgot the term, trauma-induced stress. So incident related. We have the support of a firm of psychologists with experience in this field called Mandala. So our deployees are able to call on them and have as many discussions with them as they need while they're deployed. And we're one of the few agencies that still has compulsory site debriefs when people come back. And people don't come back from Rome, because sometimes people go to HQ and go, do I really need to debrief from Rome? And then after they've done the debrief, they'll say, it's amazing, I talked for an hour. Because even if you're in Rome, there will have been things that will have stressed you out. Probably not the coffee, but that kind of thing. So we have to take it very, very seriously. It's not just reactive. Part of the job of the deployment advisors and that whole operations team is to look out for warning signs as well. And one of the nice things about the RedR gang, so we have about 20 odd people out in Cox's Bazar at the minute, and they're working lots of different agencies, but they all know each other. A lot of them are trained together, so they look out for one another, and they can be like a soft referral. So you might want to just check in on such and such. So we take that very seriously. As you say, it's pointless somebody burning themselves out within 3-4 weeks, because then they're sick, they can't do their job, we have to bring them home, and that's never good. So physical well-being and mental well-being we have to keep a very strict eye on. And when somebody comes back from deployment, part of the discussion they'll have, so they have their psych debrief, they do that first, and their medical, their clearance for the medical, then they have an operational debrief about the role, and then they sit down with our head of recruitment, Sami Munir, and he'll talk to them about, so what are your plans for the next 6 to 12 months? And some people say, don't call me for 3 months, I just need to go and be with the grandkids or be with my brother or whatever. And other people will say, I'm ready to go. And we'll say, yeah, maybe leave it 6 weeks. Or in some cases, we will negotiate with them to talk to Mandala, and Mandala will say, we don't think you should be signed off yet, you need to take the rest. Because people are always very good at recognizing their own psychological well-being, so we have to help protect them. Is that okay? Yes.
I was interested when you were talking about the Syrian refugees in Jordan and the schools that were set up, and that was the Jordanian curriculum. Is that always the case that you don't use the curriculum from the country?
No, it's one of the big problems with the issues because it's about availability of teachers.
Yeah.
I think the original thing of the Jordanian curriculum was just about availability, but it's a big issue in all of the protracted camp contexts about people recognising qualifications, being taught in languages that aren't their own. So education in emergencies isn't just about this age children, it's about vocational training, it's about teacher training. If you're going to access teachers from the refugee population, how are you ensuring quality, child protection, all of those kinds of things. But it's always a negotiation, because then it's about accessing materials. How are you going to get Syrian school supplies if you can't get them from Syria? So, all of that kind of thing. Yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah. One of the, going back to the same situation discussed just then, did you find that in the camps that there was a high crime rate, that there was a lot of issues intertribal, particularly? I know that Syrian groups can have conflicts, and they bring that into the camp, and have to have some kind of
Policing?
Policing?
Yeah, that's interesting because I don't have very detailed knowledge of it, but I do. The camp coordinator in the early days was a guy called Killian Kinderschmidt, who was UNHCR, and he talked about the problems of you ended up with suburbs effectively, and you needed somebody in charge of the suburb, and people were coming from communities where there was somebody in their community, whether it was a respected businessman or an imam or somebody who would be the person who enforced law. And he said it was really interesting to see how people had kind of risen to power almost by accident because they were the most powerful person. And one of the heads of one of these districts back in Damascus had been an air conditioning engineer. But when he'd moved, he still had money and some power, and so people were going to him as an enforcer. Obviously, the Jordanian police still had jurisdiction, and there were certainly, Daryl's got photos of riots in the early days of the camp where people were stoning and things like that. So security is an ongoing issue, but the Jordanian military and police would have the jurisdiction. From a security perspective as well. So we were filming on the Azraq camp and they sent us a security guard and we knew it was Jordanian police just keeping an eye on what we were filming. And that's fine, that's fair enough, they're the hosts. So safety and security for the community is not just the only factor, it's for the workers and stuff as well. Especially in an ongoing conflict where you've got young men in the camp and you can see many of their wounds are to do with gunshots and things like that. So you don't know if they're rebels, you don't know if they're pro-Assad. So being able to give neutral aid, you know, when the need is great, is really, really important. But understanding what the context might be is also important as well.
So I saw that in your presentation, that students have opportunity to placement and that to do a research with the Red Cross. So how I would like to know a little bit, not very detailed, a little bit overview about how can students have that opportunity.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the internships, we have an internship program that people can apply for. Obviously, our head office is down in Melbourne, so not always practical for people who are based here. But in terms of the research, we invite people who have research ideas which overlap with the range of work that we do to say, look, I'm really interested in finding out this. I'm interested in, I don't know, waste management post-disaster, and I've got that kind of environmental health background. But I'm thinking about doing some work on Vanuatu. Is this something that you might be interested in learning more about? And then we would negotiate, provide introductions perhaps, and then see how we can share the research and things like that. We sometimes call for research, but more often we're approached by people who have an area, or they may want to access our roster and find out about their resilience and things like that as well. So I'm very happy to leave my card. And if you're interested in that kind of thing, then you can contact me directly.
Yeah. So my second question is, if the people who are not in the Australia, so you mentioned that Bangladesh, Nepal, so how if the volunteer from there can be a member of the RedR or the maybe RedR volunteer teams or something?
So yes, they can. So we used to just be Australian deployees, but now we can deploy from anywhere. And I should just mention, because they're not volunteers, they get paid. So this is why they can go obviously for 3 months, 6 months a year. They're paid as experts on mission and they're embedded within the UN. So their salary is pretty reasonable. They get a proportion of salary and they get a daily subsistence allowance to pay for food and accommodation and things as well. So they're not volunteers. But yeah, and part of RedR's growth is about expanding our capacity to be able to draw people from affected communities and things like that, people with language skills. There's a shortage of people with Arabic, with Spanish, with French and other languages who can go into the emergencies. And also people who have knowledge of their own environment, who can sometimes be the best people to deploy. So there's a RedR UK, a RedR Indonesia, a RedR India and RedR Australia. But RedR is the only one with a deploying roster. The rest really focus on training. But we will take people from their rosters as well to deploy through us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.